Hello, everyone. I am Kenny Coogan, and I'm part of the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science, also known as TIES. And we're an organization that provides free resources for K through 12 educators to teach evolution in the US. Our website is tieseducation.org, and we're also active on Twitter and Facebook. Maybe a couple of months ago, I started a YouTube page where you can see archived webinars, as well as a bunch of different great resources, and all of our resources are free. If you go to the playlist, you'll also see that I put videos in based on their subject. So if you're teaching natural selection, you can go to that playlist. If you're teaching genetics, you can go to that playlist. If you go to tieseducation.org/tips, you'll see that we are looking for tips. Our motto is teachers helping teachers. So let's say you've been teaching for 1 year, or let's say you've been teaching for 30 years. You might have expertise that we are looking for. So the types of tips that we're looking for are, how do you address common evolution misconceptions in your classroom? How do you address the phrase, just a theory? And how do you make children comfortable who are told that evolution is against their religion? So if you have a tip for one of those three things, you can submit it. We're just looking for a short little 3 to 6 minute video. And the idea is then we'll have this really great extensive library, all for free on YouTube. And then other teachers can see what you do, and then they can implement it in their classroom. And if we really like your tip, I will send you a free t-shirt. All right, like I said, all of our resources are free. All of our labs are free. Most of our labs are either free to implement, or they're going to be less than $5 because we know teachers struggle with budgets these days. But one thing that we do sell is our brand new book. It's called On Teaching Evolution. And the reason why we sell it is because we had to pay the publisher to print it. So this is the only thing that we're selling. If you go to our website, tieseducation.org, you can order it. The foreword was written by Dr. Richard Dawkins. Another branch of education that we do is called Young Skeptics. We're all under Center for Inquiry. And Young Skeptics is a program to develop and foster an understanding of the world through inquiry-based learning. So we want children to be able to identify how to navigate the world through science. Another branch of education that we're doing is called Science Saves. So you can visit that, sciencesaves.org. And just like the other two branches of education we're doing, all of our resources were created by teachers for teachers, and all of our resources over there are also free. And that includes PowerPoints, rubrics, lots of great resources. Part of Science Saves every year, at least for the next 4 years, we will be having a scholarship that ends in May. It's for high school seniors, and all they have to do is submit a 30-second video, kind of like a TikTok style video, about how science has improved their lives. So people can submit a video about how their asthma inhaler has helped them. If they have an artificial limb, they can write a video about that. They can write about antibiotics. They can write about vaccines. And if their video is chosen as one of the winners, the top winner receives $10,000 to help them attend college. And they could use it to get to college. They can attend it for room and board. They can use it for books. They can use that money for whatever they want. And we have 3 or 4 winners every year. The deadline is May 8th. Easy to remember. It is my birthday on May 8th. And you can also go to our website and click on the 2022 winners and show your high school seniors the videos from last year to be inspired. If you are attending Danielle's webinar live, at the bottom of the Zoom, you will see that there's a little chat box, and please type your questions there. And then at the end, I will ask Danielle, I will trickle those questions to Danielle and ask her all at the end. So without further ado, we're going to learn about olfaction in birds. So thank you very much, Danielle Whittaker, for attending our TIES webinar.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to talk to this group. Let's see. That look all right?
Perfect. I'm going to mute myself and stop my video.
All right, thank you very much. All right, hi everyone. I'm Danielle Whittaker, and I'm going to talk about olfaction in birds today. So the chemical senses, which include smell and taste, have been called the most ancient and universal senses. And that's because every living creature on the planet has these senses in some form. They're important for survival because it helps you sense the environment around you. I'm going to go through some examples here, starting with bacteria. Bacteria have a behavior known as chemotaxis, and that means that if they sense a beneficial chemical in their environment, they will move towards it. And if they sense a harmful chemical, they'll move away from it. So even bacteria have this kind of sense. Plants can communicate using chemicals as well. I have here a picture of tobacco plants, and I love this example because it actually involves communication among a bunch of different species. So tobacco plants are eaten by the tobacco hornworm. It's a kind of caterpillar. And of course, having your leaves eaten is harmful to a plant. And tobacco plants have evolved this really cool system where when tobacco hornworm chews on the plant, its saliva mixes with another chemical in the plant's leaves that produces an airborne compound. This airborne compound attracts another insect called the big-eyed bug. The big-eyed bug is attracted to that scent, and it actually comes and it eats the tobacco hornworms, which I think is just fascinating and cool. So bacteria can communicate or understand the world around them through chemicals. Plants can communicate this way. Moving up to larger animals, thinking about salmon, you're probably familiar with the idea of salmon migrating every year, swimming upstream to their spawning grounds. They are following a pheromone in the water put out by other salmon. It's an aggregation pheromone that when there's a lot of salmon in the water, this pheromone will get very strong because they're all emitting it, and it helps them find the path to get to their spawning grounds. And then finally, again, another very familiar example here. We know that dogs have a good sense of smell. In fact, they're quite famous for it. We use dogs for, sniffing for contraband and luggage at the airport. We know dogs can follow the trails of their owners over vast distances if they get lost, right? So we respect their ability to use smell. And again, this is a sense that is present in all of life. And yet, as happens a lot, actually, we like to think that humans are a little bit special. We like to think we're different from the rest of the natural world. You may have heard the idea that humans don't have a very good sense of smell compared to other animals. And this is a persistent myth that's been around for a couple hundred years. But in fact, it's not actually based on any scientific evidence. This is a paper that was published in Science magazine about 5 years ago. Looking into where this idea came from, I'll just read you the quote here. The idea doesn't come from studies of the human brain or our ability to smell, but instead from a famous 19th century anatomist's hypothesis that the evolution of human free will required a reduction in the proportional size of the brain's olfactory bulb. So the olfactory bulb is the part of the brain that processes the inputs from your nose and helps you understand what you're smelling. And this man, Paul Broca, believed that human free will meant that we didn't need a sense of smell, and that evolution saw to it that we didn't really use it anymore. What he's looking at here is the increase in the size of the frontal lobe. This is where thinking happens. He is a great anatomist. There's in fact a part of the brain named after him. Broca's area is where we produce speech. But this idea that olfaction is kind of a lower, an ancient sense that humans have risen above that somehow, right? We have free will. We don't need to rely on our instincts to process the world around us. We can process it rationally instead. And then hidden in this is the idea of a trade-off, that if you evolve to be good at one thing, you have to give up something else. But again, there's actually no evidence for this idea that humans have a poor sense of smell. And in fact, more recent studies have shown that human capabilities in the area of smell can actually rival those of dogs. I love this study that this picture is from here on the screen. There's two photographs here. And both are showing a trail that has been a scent trail that has been dragged through the grass. So on the left is a dead pheasant. The yellow is the path that the pheasant was dragged, and the red is showing the path that a dog took in tracking the scent of the pheasant. On the right is a photograph showing the yellow is where chocolate was dragged through the grass, and Then the red is showing the path that a human volunteer, who's in the photograph here, took to follow that trail using their sense of smell. So the human volunteers in this study, they wore, their eyes were covered, their ears were covered, their hands were covered. They could only use smell to track the scent of chocolate in the grass. And it turns out they actually did just as good a job as dogs did. And you'll notice the paths they took, the red there, actually follow a very similar pattern. It's this distinctive zigzag pattern that we use when tracking scent. You are following where the smell gets when the smell gets stronger, you move towards it, and when it gets weaker, you move away from it, which results in this zigzag pattern. I was talking about dogs and all the things they can smell, thinking about your luggage at the airport. We also have trained dogs to smell some kinds of cancer in humans. And it turns out that humans are also capable of sensing illness through smell. We know that humans can detect when another person is sick very quickly after they become sick based on not just visual cues in the face, but also odor. And then there's here's at least one example of someone with an extraordinary sense of smell. So in this photograph, the woman on the right is named Joy Milne, and she has the ability to smell Parkinson's disease. She learned she had this ability when her husband was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and she realized that she had noticed that he has been smelling differently for a few months leading up to the diagnosis. And then when she and her husband went to a support group for families living with Parkinson's, she realized that all of the Parkinson's patients in that room had the same smell. So she's been working for a few years now with doctors and scientists to develop a non-invasive way to detect Parkinson's just based on the volatile or airborne compounds given off by the patient's skin, which I think is absolutely fascinating. Why am I talking about humans? You came here to hear about birds. Well, I'm talking about humans because there's some really interesting parallels here in our beliefs about the sense of smell and how we came to those beliefs. So birds, again, are thought to be, have long been thought to be an exception to the idea that every living creature has a sense of smell or some way to sense chemicals. And I haven't checked in a few weeks, but every time I check this Wikipedia article on olfaction, the sentence is still there, saying most mammals have a good sense of smell, whereas most birds do not. And then it lists a few exceptions to this supposed rule. So some seabirds, vultures, and kiwis, which have long been accepted to as an unusual example of a bird that uses a sense of smell. But when you dig into this idea more deeply, you can't find any scientific backing to it. There's no reason to believe that birds don't have a good sense of smell. But you'll find statements like this on the internet. One of my favorites is the idea that owls are the only natural predator of skunks, because they have no sense of smell. The idea, of course, is that skunks give off this noxious odor when they're in danger. And if you don't have a sense of smell, then you can ignore that and eat it. Well, this is not true for a couple of different reasons. One being that owls are not the only natural predator of skunks. Wolves eat them, coyotes eat them, and no one has ever doubted their sense of smell. But also owls do have a sense of smell. Another common myth that I've heard a lot, this actually goes a couple of different ways. You may have heard when you were a kid that if you touched a baby bird in the nest, the mom would abandon the nest because it's smelled like humans. That's not true. A mother bird will not abandon a nest, will not abandon her babies based on scent. But some people took this and went the wrong way. So this was an old public service announcement from a wildlife rescue organization in North Carolina. It says, yes, you touched me. Now please put me back. My mom can't smell and she won't care that you touched me. She will care if I don't come home. So good message, put the bird back in the nest, bad science. It's not because mom doesn't have a sense of smell. I am happy to say that this organization has changed this sign and they're no longer making that claim. So they're back on track with the right science. Where does this idea come from, though? Well, much like the ideas about humans and our sense of smell, it dates back to the 19th century, and it actually dates back to John James Audubon himself. In this paper he published in 1826 with the title, Account of the Habits of the Turkey Buzzard, particularly with the view of exploding the opinion generally entertained of its extraordinary power of smelling. Now, hopefully you can tell from that title that he had an idea he was setting out to prove. At this point in time, everybody generally accepted that turkey vultures use their sense of smell to find prey or to find food. So You're probably also familiar with this, that you'll see vultures circling somewhere near an area where there's roadkill, and that's because they can smell the odor given off by that. He believed that vultures and buzzards used not their sense of smell, but their sight. He believed that birds had exceptional eyesight, and many of them do. And in order for that to have evolved, they would have had to give something up, had to give up something. So again, here's the same idea of a trade-off, and the idea that smell wasn't important to their lives. So he did a series of very poorly designed experiments that he felt showed that they used sight and not odor to find food on the ground. One great example of this was the experiment in which he took a rotting hog carcass and put it under some bushes and waited to see if the vultures showed up. They didn't, and he said, well, that means they couldn't see it, and that therefore they didn't know it was there. He also notes in his paper, though, that there were vultures circling overhead all day, and there were dogs attacking the carcass, which probably deterred the vultures from showing up. It has since been shown that vultures do have a good sense of smell. And in fact, all birds are able to use scent, and we have seen studies in the last few years across all different kinds of species of birds, and we know that they use scent to find food. So not just vultures, but seabirds, that like the wandering albatross that fly for many, many miles over open ocean. They know where to find fish in the ocean to eat because they're following the scent that's actually given off by large aggregations of phytoplankton, and that's where you're going to find the fish. And so they know, they use sense of smell here. Birds can detect the scent of predators near their nest. This study I'm citing here, it was one in which they used urine from predators like weasels and cats and put it near empty nest boxes, and birds would avoid the nest boxes that had the scent of predators and would use nest boxes that didn't have that scent instead. And speaking of nest boxes, this is a kind of a specialized one here. This is a blue tit and nest box. And these little birds, when they're building their nest, they include these aromatic herbs that help keep the nest free from ectoparasites like feather mites and things like that can be harmful to their nestlings when they hatch. And what's really cool about this study is they showed that the birds were able to tell when those herbs lost their odor, and that's when they needed to be replaced. So once they couldn't smell them anymore, they took them out and put in fresh ones. Now, my particular area of interest is how birds use scent in social behavior and social signaling. So this photograph is two crested auklets, which are an Arctic seabird. Julie Hagelin, a colleague of mine, studied these birds and was particularly interested in the fact that during the breeding season, they smell very strongly like tangerines. The whole colony just smells like citrus fruit. And she noticed that they do this behavior, and it's in the picture here, where they get together and they'll put their beaks into each other's feathers around the nape of the neck. And it's like they're taking a big sniff of the odor there. And that's actually where the odor is strongest in the feathers. And she was able to show that this is a social behavior. It has some sort of way that they're interacting with each other. And interestingly, this odor is strongest in the breeding season. So in most birds, the source of odor is preen oil, which is secreted by the uropygial gland. That is a gland located above the base of the tail. It's the only large exocrine gland in most birds. It secretes this oil that birds use while they're preening. That's the name. They spread it on their feathers. They'll take some oil on their bill, spread it on their feathers while preening, and it helps protect the feathers from exposure to sunlight and water and ectoparasites. It helps keep them healthy, helps with thermoregulation and waterproofing. And it's also the source of volatile compounds, airborne compounds that give the bird an odor. So in the top two pictures, you can see the gland and where it's located. And then the bottom left, it's me taking a sample from a common grackle who's not too thrilled with me. And then on the bottom right is the glass capillary tube that I use to sample this odor. You just rub it against the gland and it secretes the oil, much like the bird rubbing the gland with its own beak. And that tiny little amount is enough to analyze. So most of the work I've done has been with the dark-eyed junco. This is a widespread North American sparrow that breeds primarily at high altitudes and high latitudes. So you'll find them breeding in the mountain ranges and high up in Canada. This is a really interesting group of birds to study because in the last 10,000 years, they rapidly diverged into a number of different subspecies after the last glaciation. And you can see some variation in their feather coloration. They are still capable of interbreeding, although it's rare. And so here I've listed just some of the subspecies I've worked with a lot. Most of the talk I'll be focusing on work I've done with slate-colored juncos in Virginia and Oregon juncos in California. So like many birds in temperate areas, they are socially monogamous seasonal breeders. So that means in the breeding season, which is the summer, they will form territorial pairs. So a male and a female will declare an area of their own, they will defend it, and they will build a nest, and the female will lay an average of 2 clutches per season, and about 4 nestlings will hatch out of each clutch. Now, I'm underlining and highlighting the fact that they are socially monogamous. They form pairs, they work together to raise their offspring, but they're not necessarily genetically monogamous. So again, like some humans we all know, they often will mate outside of that pair. So we've done paternity testing with juncos, just the same kind of paternity testing you do with humans. And we've found that up to about 30% of all offspring in every population of juncos that we've tested, about 30% of those offspring were actually sired by an extra pair male. So their father, their genetic father, is not the same male that's raising them. And this is really common in monogamous and socially monogamous songbirds in North America. They do help raise the offspring though, so they have biparental care. Only females incubate the eggs and brood the nestlings, so they're the only ones sitting on the nest, but the males stick around the whole time, and both males and females feed those nestlings once they've hatched. Okay, so now I've got some background on why I'm studying smell, and the birds that I'm studying. Now I'm going to go through some of my major research questions and just show you some of the work I've done. So back when I first started researching this question in 2008, people were still saying that birds had no sense of smell. Scientists were saying this, and I thought that was a very strange thing to believe. There was no scientific evidence for it, and so we found that there was odor present in this preen oil. So that was actually a study before I joined the lab that had done that. And I wanted to know, well, what information is present in that odor? If we can communicate with odors, that means there's information there that you can learn about each other from. So in order to study this, I had to work with a chemistry lab. Identifying the compounds in a clear, invisible odor, right, is kind of challenging. But there's a method called gas chromatography mass spectrometry that we use to do this. So chromatography just means you separate out the components of a mixture, usually on the basis of size of the molecules. And then mass spectrometry is what we use to identify those molecules. So here I've got 2 birds. It's a gray catbird on the top and a northern cardinal on the bottom. And then next to them, I'm showing you the GCMS, or gas chromatography mass spectrometry data from the preen oil of each bird. So just to orient you to what you're looking at here, on the x-axis, these numbers, these are minutes. And so what we're looking at here, the larger a molecule is, the longer it will take to pass through a tube in this machine. So the molecules that come out first at 5 minutes, 10 minutes, those are the smaller molecules, and the larger ones are going to be further down on this end. And then on the y-axis is just a measure of abundance, so the strength of the signal. And so what you'll notice is that there's certainly some similarities between the 2 species. So like this peak right here around 25 minutes is about the same, although it's stronger on the bottom. But there's a lot of variation, a lot of differences between the 2 species. And what we found consistently is that members of the same species will have roughly similar profiles, these GCMS profiles. And so you can actually identify species on the basis of their odor this way. If you look within a species, though, there's even more variation. So here are some juncos. I've found that their preen oil odor communicates information about their identity. So each individual junco has their own blend of the compounds. They all have the same compounds, but they vary in the relative proportions of those. So you can think about perfumes. You know, there's only so many odors that we put into perfume. They're usually floral or citrus or musk, but each type of perfume will have different amounts of those compounds. Here I'm showing you 4 very common compounds that we see in juncos. The ones that I've put in blue are 2 methyl ketones that we find in higher abundance in males, or higher proportions in males. And the 2 pink ones are carboxylic acids that we see in higher proportions in females. So we don't have a male pheromone or a female pheromone. In fact, I avoid the word pheromone. We can talk about that later. But if you look at the blend as a whole, you can tell the difference between a male and a female. We also see that preen oil odor communicates information about breeding condition. So this graph on the left was one of the first studies done on this topic in juncos, comparing the compounds in breeding birds and non-breeding birds. So this is a list of the linear alcohols that we find in their preen oil. And then the y-axis is concentration. The orange bars are the amounts that we see in males that are in breeding condition. And then those dark blue bars, which are very tiny, are the amounts of these same compounds that we see in males in non-breeding condition in the winter. So males are producing significantly higher amounts of these compounds when they're in breeding condition, which said to me right away, this must be important in mating behavior somehow. Maybe it's important in attracting mates. Females also produce these compounds, and in another study, I tracked the very beginning of the breeding season. So March, April, when they're forming pairs, they're picking out territories. Females are starting to build nests. The males are singing. They're starting to mate. Hormones are ramping up. Right, this is a big time of change. And so I looked in both males and females at these compounds and their increase and what that looked like. In males, it was just a steady increase every week. It got higher and higher. In females, though, during those 4 weeks, there was really no change between week 1 and 2, and then a big jump in week 3. And then it went back down a little in week 4. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. What was going on in the population in week 3? And when I looked at data on egg laying, I found that week 3 was when most of the females in our study population were laying eggs. So this suggests that this could be a signal that they are ovulating. It could be important in signaling between males and females and helping coordinate their breeding attempts. Beyond breeding, though, preen oil communicates other information, including aggression levels. So this was another study in which my colleague Kim Rosfall and I did what we call simulated territorial intrusions, or STIs. So basically you take a bird in a small cage and you take an iPod speaker and you play back Junco song. So you put that bird in the speaker in the middle of a wild bird's territory, and they will react as if it's a wild bird invading their territory. They'll come out and they'll attack it. Bird's fine, he's safe in the cage, but it gives us a way to measure how aggressively that resident male will react towards an intruder. And when we took that data and compared it to the odor of their preen oil, so this is a compound measure. It's not that important, but this is a measure of the different compounds in their preen oil. We see a significant positive correlation between their odor and how aggressive they were. So that's other information that the birds can get through smell. Okay. So I did a lot of work trying to understand what information was there, right? But if they can't smell it, then communication's not happening. So next research question I want to talk about is, how do we know that birds can detect these odors? And this was, in fact, the first work I did, thinking about, well, what's this idea that birds don't have a sense of smell? All animals have a sense of smell. And I was thinking about what kind of work I could do in the field. I was going to the field that summer anyway. We were studying breeding birds. And I was thinking about the context of birds sitting on their nests and thinking about that idea, that myth of that birds will reject nestlings that smell like humans. Now, as a bird biologist, I handled a lot of baby birds, and I knew that birds did not reject the nests that we had handled. But I also knew that there are birds like this beautiful brown-headed cowbird on top. These are brood parasites. They don't build their own nests. They lay their eggs in the nests of other species, and those species will accept those eggs and raise them like they're their own, even though those cowbirds look nothing like their own nestlings. which is kind of a strange behavior. And compare that to what we know about mammals, who we know that scent is extremely important in parental care in mammals. So we know that in many species, given the choice, a mother will prefer the scent of her own young compared to someone else's young. And then thinking about particularly livestock, we know that, say you've got an orphaned baby goat, you want that goat to survive, so you want to give it to a mother goat to help to raise it. The way to make her accept it is to apply her own scent to that baby goat, and she will treat it as if it's her own. So these two different scenarios here do make it seem like scent might not be that important to birds in parental care. So thinking about preen oil, I said, well, what happens if I put preen oil from another bird on a bird's nest? So I was in Virginia looking at slate-colored juncos on their nests, like this lady here. And I took preen oil and I created 3 different treatment groups. So 1/3 of the birds in my study got preen oil from themselves. So we had captured all the birds at the beginning of the field season. I had taken preen oil and I would put her own oil on her nest. Another 1/3 would get preen oil taken from a different junco, and in fact, a junco from a different subspecies. So we had Oregon juncos in the lab when I was at Indiana University, and I had taken and frozen preen oil from them. And then finally, the 3rd group received preen oil from another species that was unfamiliar to them. In this case, I chose northern mockingbirds. The real reason for that choice is because they were also in the lab, a different lab at Indiana, and they were freely available to me, so I was able to collect preen oil ahead of time. But also they are not typically found in the same place as juncos in the breeding season. They're also not a threat to them, so I'm not presenting them with a threat species. It's just an unfamiliar odor. So I had 24 nests in my study. And what I did was, before I put preen oil in the nest, the day before, I would take a 4-hour video of that bird sitting on her nest. They don't just sit on the nest and never move, right? They get up pretty frequently, actually, to go find food, to go relieve themselves off the nest, to do whatever birdie things they need to do. And so I took a 4-hour video to get sort of a baseline understanding of that individual's behavior. How long does she tend to sit on the nest before getting up again? And then the next day at the same time, I applied preen oil, whichever treatment group they were in, on 1 drop on each egg, and then 4 drops around the edges of the nest. And I took another 4-hour video, and I compared her behavior after treatment to her baseline behavior the day before. Now, this meant I watched a whole lot of boring videos of birds sitting on nests, but I did see some cool things. Hopefully this will play all right. Yep. So here it's a little bit fuzzy. This was before digital video, but there's a junco sitting on a nest back here. She's just returned after I've applied preen oil to her nest, and she looks like she's noticed something is different and wrong. She's a little bit disturbed. She gets up and she picks up some nesting material from the places where I've applied preen oil, and then she takes it away from the nest. So this particular bird, when I went back and looked at what I had put on her nest, it was mockingbird preen oil. Now, if she had been the only one who had done anything, that really wouldn't tell us much. That would be a single instance. But when I compared the data from the whole study, I found a significant result here. So birds, female juncos on whose nest I had applied mockingbird preen oil, they got up and left the nest much more quickly than they had the previous day. So here the light bars are their average incubation bout the day before treatment. And then the dark green bars are the average length of the incubation bout from each bird after they came back, like immediately after I applied the preen oil. So you can see this huge decrease in time on the nest that I applied mockingbird preen oil. The nests that received preen oil from a different junco, they also decreased their time, but not as much. And then the nests where it was the female's own preen oil that I applied, it was nearly identical amount of time that they spent on the nest compared to the day before. I will also point out that this effect only occurred in that first incubation bout. So when they first came back after I put on the preen oil, after that, they kind of went back to their baseline behavior. And that could be because the smell evaporated. It could be because they habituated to the scent. They didn't really notice it anymore. It could be because they determined it wasn't a threat. We don't really know the answer to that. But I felt this demonstrated that birds could certainly detect odors from preen oil, and they could get information about the bird that it came from. They knew if it was a different species or their own species or themselves. And since that work, a lot more recent work has been done that shows that birds can actually identify close relatives by odor. And this starts in the nest. So females know the scent of their own nest. They know the scent of their own nestlings. And chicks know the scent of their mothers. And in fact, they can recognize odors that they smelled before they even hatched. And you can take eggs from nests and switch them, and they'll still know the scent of their genetic mother. As adults, they also can recognize that someone is closely related to them, even if they never met when they were nestlings. So odor is very important in kin recognition and recognizing your relatives. And this will come back up later in this talk. So at this point in time, I've been doing a lot of work looking at what information is present in the odors, how the birds were sensing it. And people were starting to ask me some interesting questions at conferences and things. They're like, well, that's cool, but what's the genetic pathway? How are they producing these odors? Can we find the genes that make these odors? And I didn't know the answer to that. But I was giving a talk about my work to a group of other chemical ecology researchers at Michigan State University, where I was working at that time. And I had this list of these compounds that I've been talking about. And one of the other people in the group, Kevin Tice, he looked at this and he said, well, all of these compounds are known microbial byproducts of microbial metabolism. Have you ever thought about whether there are bacteria in the uropygial gland producing these odors? And at that point in time, I hadn't given bacteria any thought at all. But what he was referring to was something known as the fermentation hypothesis for chemical signaling, which has been around since the 70s. And it's specifically thinking about mammals and their scent pouches. So you think about mammals scent marking things and they produce these secretions that are specifically used for that. And this is the idea that those scent pouches and scent glands are home to symbiotic bacteria, and that those bacteria produce volatile or airborne odorants, and that those odorants produced by the bacteria are actually what the animals are using as recognition cues. It's how they're recognizing who left this smell on this thing. And then, of course, there's variation in bacterial communities. Different species might have different bacteria, different individuals, and that's what contributes to the variation in the scents that they're using. So this idea has been studied and supported in a number of mammalian species, including spotted hyenas, meerkats, sack-winged bats, and European badgers. But at that point in time, it had never been investigated in birds. I went back to my list of compounds and looked at the scientific literature and found that nearly all of them were known to be produced by bacteria. And thought again about the uropygial gland or preen gland. It's dark, it's warm, it's moist. It's probably a pretty good place to grow bacteria. So it's got a lot in common with a mammalian scent gland. So Kevin and I teamed up. Here's Kevin on the left. During his postdoctoral work, he studied the scent pouches of spotted hyenas. And that's him in Kenya with a anesthetized hyena that he's sampling. And then me on the right, I went back to the field in Virginia to take bacterial samples from Junco uropygial glands. And we worked together to figure out what was in those samples. So the first thing we did was to determine whether there's any bacteria in there at all. So on the left is a scanning electron microscopy photograph from one of my preen oil samples. And this is, you can see some round blobby things there. And we think at least some of these, particularly this guy here on the bottom left, are probably bacteria. But even better than that, we used a genetic method. You can do sort of a genetic survey of a particular gene that all bacteria carry, and you can identify what bacteria are present based on the DNA sequences. And we found that Junco uropygial glands are home to a rich and diverse microbiome. You can see that initial survey of bacterial species on the right, including many known odor-producing bacteria. And those are the ones I'm highlighting in green. So great, we've got bacteria, we've got odor-producing bacteria. Next, we wanted to know, are these bacteria actually producing the odors that I've been studying in Juncos? And so the first way we tested that was using an antibiotic study to knock out bacteria in uropygial glands. So here I worked with captive Juncos, and we used a broad spectrum antibiotic called enrofloxacin. And half of the birds in the study received an injection of this antibiotic directly in their uropygial glands once a day for 5 days. The control group received injections of saline, so they're treated the same way, but no antibiotics. And then we took samples from them at the beginning of the study and the end of the study and tested whether their bacterial communities changed and whether their odors changed. So first, of course, as you would expect, the antibiotic treatment did change the bacterial communities. As you may be familiar with taking antibiotics yourself, of course, it doesn't knock out all of the bacteria, but it does change the community. So here, this is a principal coordinates analysis. This is compiling a lot of data on all the different kinds of bacteria here. So these are not, these aren't exactly real numbers, but they give you some information about what's going on in the samples. The light blue dots are birds before they received antibiotics, and the dark blue dots are birds after they received antibiotics. And there is a statistical difference between these two groups. So the closer they clump together, the more similar they are. But what changed here becomes even more obvious when we draw a line connecting the same birds before and after treatment. So you can see they all kind of shifted to the right along that coordinate 1 axis. What does that mean in real words? Well, when you look back statistically at what contributes to coordinate 1, we found that what was happening was that the birds that received antibiotics were showing a big reduction in 2 particular types of bacteria, Staphylococcus and Pseudomonas. So, okay, we had a big impact on their bacteria, and we saw a significant change in the preen-oil odor. So here I'm showing you all of the birds in the study. The blue are the control birds, and the pink and red are the antibiotic birds. The light colors are before they received treatment, and the dark colors are after. And you can see, looking at the red birds, a big reduction in the linear alcohols and methyl ketones, which are just 2 of the kinds of chemicals in their odor that decreased after antibiotic treatment. So we saw a decrease in particular bacteria, decrease in some of these odorous compounds. Great, that's really cool. It's still just a correlation though, so we wanted to go 1 step further. And so I went back to the field and I collected more preen oil, and then we cultured that preen oil in petri dishes. We grew the bacteria that lives in that preen oil in petri dishes in the lab. And then we measured the odor given off by those bacteria without the bird anywhere near them, right? So this is just bacteria on their own and the odors they produce. So I'm going to show you a heat map. So the darker the color, the stronger, the more abundant the bacteria, the more abundant the odor. Along the x-axis here, the list of the compounds that I've been talking about all along. And then on the right here, this is the list of bacteria that we successfully cultured in petri dishes directly from the preen oil. And here are the odors that they produced. So right away, you might notice that every single one of these compounds is produced by at least one of the bacteria, and every single one of these bacteria produces several of these compounds. Now, any individual Junco will have many of these bacteria. You put them all together and you've got Junco smell. So we felt this showed pretty clearly that yes, the bacteria present in Junco preen oil is responsible for creating the odor that the birds use when they're communicating with each other. So thinking about that, and thinking about the fact that this odor is so important for recognizing family members, for example, for understanding, whether the bird you're smelling is in breeding condition or how aggressive they might be, it became really interested in understanding what influences those bacterial communities, right? There's got to be something about the bird that influences their bacteria that makes the smell tell you something about that bird at the base of it all. So thinking about bacteria, why do family members smell alike? Is genetic relatedness driving it, or is it something else? So I went back to the field, and this was again in Virginia, and we sampled whole families of Juncos. So this was a great time to do it because we were studying breeding birds, and we were tagging birds in the nest. So there's some 6-day-old Juncos in my hand there in the picture on the right, and they just got their bands. And then on the left, I'm showing you a map of our study site. So much of this work is done at Mountain Lake Biological Station, which is here. It's so named for Mountain Lake. There's also a famous resort hotel there, Mountain Lake Hotel. If you've ever seen the movie Dirty Dancing, that's where many of the scenes were filmed. And so on this map, this black line going up is a road. It's about 2 miles between the hotel and the biological station here. And it's all surrounded by forest. And this is where a long-term study of juncos has been going on since the 1980s. And then here are the dots are the nests that I sampled with their particular codes indicating who they are. And they're color-coded. And I'll be using that color coding when I show you the data. So I had 9 nests, and remember I mentioned that they're socially monogamous, but not genetically monogamous. So of course we did paternity testing on these nests, so we knew the relatedness level between all of the birds involved. So of my 9 nests, 3 of them had only within pair young, so their parents were the 2 birds that were raising them. 2 of the nests had only extra pair young, so the males at those nests were raising somebody else's offspring, and 4 of the nests had mixed paternity. So there were both within pair and extra pair young in the nest. So there were multiple fathers of the birds in that nest. So overall, I had 27 nestlings in the study, and about 40% of them were extra pair young. And this was great because it gave me a variety of genetic relatedness to work with in my study. So starting with the bacterial communities, looking at the results there. So again, there's the map on the left, and the color coding relates to where the nests are. And then on the right is showing you another one of these kind of principal coordinates analyses. And the open circles are the samples from nestlings, and the closed circles are samples from their parents. And the birds from with the same color are from the same nest. So the first thing you should notice is that the samples of the same color are clustering together. That means they're more similar. So these 3 purple nestlings from this purple nest, they are very similar in their bacterial communities. And their parents are over here, but they're very similar to each other as well. And you can see the same pattern with all the colors. We do see that the adults and the nestlings are a bit different. We see a statistical difference based on that age class. We also see that nest identity is significant here. So birds from the same nest have similar bacteria. We found the same pattern in their odors. This is a very similar type of analysis, same coding scheme and everything. Again, you see that separation between the adults and the nestlings. And again, you see that birds of the same color are clustering together. That means they smell more alike. This graph looks a little funny because I've got this one outlier. But statistically, it's the same kind of result that we just saw in the last graph. So birds from the same nest have similar bacteria, similar odors. If we look more closely at these within family relationships, though, there's some even more interesting patterns. So comparing nestlings to their mothers versus comparing them to their fathers, we see that mother-offspring pairs are more similar. So here I'm using something called the Brayton-Curtis Similarity Index. It's comparing the whole bacterial community. It goes from 0 to 1. The closer to 1 you are, so if you score a 1, that means you're identical. If you score a 0, it means you have nothing in common. So the closer to 1, the more similar you are. So your average mother-offspring pair was more similar to each other than your average father-offspring pair. And of course, we can compare fathers who are also the genetic fathers versus fathers who were just raising somebody else's offspring. And it didn't matter. It didn't matter if the father was genetically related to the offspring or not. They had the same level of similarity at their bacteria. And we can also look at siblings. The siblings have the highest level of similarity. But it didn't matter if they were full siblings or half siblings. Remember, we had some nests with mixed paternity. And when you think about this, when you think about bacteria, and you think about a bird's nest, these are small little nests. You got 4 birds in there and they're getting bigger and bigger. Of course, they're sharing bacteria, right? You would expect that the nestlings would all be very similar at their bacteria. And of course, the mother is the only one sitting on the nest. And so you would again expect that the mother is more similar to the nestlings than the father. So what we're seeing here is that the primary driver of this similarity is not genetic relatedness. It's social behavior. It's how much time they're spending physically touching each other and sharing bacteria with each other. So this information about relatedness is actually coming from, information about spending physical time together. So I think I've used up most of my time here, but I just quick recap of the 4 studies. First, I showed that bird odor is present in preen. Bird odor that is present in preen oil conveys information about the individual, including breeding condition, aggressive behavior, identity, and so on. We know that birds can detect these odors and change their behavior in response to it, just like thinking about that nest study and whether or not they decided to get up and leave the nest because it smelled funny. We discovered that symbiotic bacteria present in these glands are actually producing the odors, and that it's actually social behavior and not genetic relatedness that's driving how similar to individuals' bacterial communities are, and therefore affecting their odor. So that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed my talk. There's lots more information like this in my book. Here's my contact information on the right. I always love hearing from people and getting questions. I love seeing pictures of birds if people want to share those with me. And then my Twitter handle is, of course, Junco, which is easy to remember. So thank you. And I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Danielle Whittaker. So yes, I put your link to the book, The Secret Perfume of Birds, Uncovering the Science of Avian Scent. I put the link in the chat box, and we do have several great questions. And I forgot to mention when I was introducing you, but I did put in the chat box that if you're attending this session live, the publisher has been kind enough to give us 2 books to give away. So we're excited to do that. Okay. The first question is from Bertha Vasquez. She's the director of the education parts of Center for Inquiry, which includes TIES. And she says, I thought many human scent genes were broken or knocked out. 99% is quoted in many texts and like textbooks. Can we really rival dog sense of smell? Is it a misconception that we traded smell for sight?
Yes, so here I believe you're talking about olfactory receptor genes. And so those are the genes that code for the olfactory receptors in the brain that can, the olfactory receptors in the nasal passages that then, it's a very complicated system. So yeah, a lot of the olfactory receptors that we see in other mammals are not functional in humans. That's correct. I don't think 99% is correct. And I think we're still discovering new families of olfactory receptors. So it's incredibly complicated. It is quite likely true that dogs do have more active, more functional olfactory receptors than humans do, but haven't satisfactorily shown that that correlates to strength of ability to smell. There's a really great book called Smellosophy that's sort of going through the science of smell and why it's so complicated and why these kinds of correlations are very hard to make. But yeah, that's a good question. And yes, I do believe it's a misconception that we traded smell for sight, because I don't think there's no evidence that you would have to give up one sense in order to get good at another one.
I majored in animal behavior for my undergrad, and I remember a video of them having like college students wear a t-shirt, and then they rubbed the t-shirt on a lawn, and then you could like see the other undergraduates like chasing the smell because they were blindfolded. But I could not find that video in a quick Google search now, but it was impressive nonetheless.
Nice.
Tiffany asks, I work with birds of prey. I noticed that vultures in particular have a different smell. Any chance some of these odors are coming out of their stomach, or all odors are from their glands? And I will say that we work with parrot owners, and they've also said like, oh, Amazon parrots and cockatoos smell different than other types of parrots. So
yes.
What do you think, Danielle?
Great question. The preen oil is not the only source of odor. In fact, there are birds that don't have uropygial glands. So there are other sources of odor that come from the skin. So the very first bird I talked about in terms of social signaling was the crested auklet, the ones that smell like tangerine odor. That odor is not coming from their preen oil. We don't actually know where it's coming from. But it may be bacteria on the skin or on the feathers that are contributing. I don't think we've figured that out yet. In terms of vultures, yes, there's a lot of different places those odors could be coming from. There might be vulture behaviors involved in the way that they feed that would contribute to a different odor. Absolutely.
Francie asks, does the odor change when exposed to sunlight?
Great question. I have no idea. That's the first time I've ever been asked that question. I'm sorry I don't have an answer, but I will be thinking about it now.
Very good. Do you think, how often are they preening? Like the juncos is when she was asking that question. Are they preening like 20 times a day, one time a day?
No, so preening behavior really changes depending on their situation. So some people have found that they'll preen more often when they're really stressed. They might preen more often when they're trying to attract a mate. So yeah, it is highly variable.
Robin asks, do the concentrations change when the subject is threatened by a predator?
Ooh, good question. So I haven't been able to do a satisfactory study, but I've got some evidence suggesting that cortisol, corticosterone, actually a stress-related hormone, can affect these odors. One of the things that complicates the answer to this, though, is that it can take a while for that to happen. So they're not like constantly squirting out preen oil, right? Like it'd be something that would take a while to change. So you're not going to see an immediate response to their environment, like thinking about like, some sea creatures that can, give off a chemical when they're threatened. That's a good question. But I suspect that if they are subject to a lot of predation stress, constant threats, they probably would smell different than birds who don't, just because of the stress hormone differences.
Leah would like to know, similar to the human example from earlier, do you think that birds can detect illness in other birds through scent?
I suspect they can. I don't know of a study that's directly tested that, but we have seen correlations between scent and the bird's physical condition. So that's something we measure looking at their current body condition relative to their size. And studies have found that birds will behave differently around the scent of a bird in better condition than themselves, compared to the scent from a bird in worse condition than themselves.
Okay, because of time, we're going to do 2 more questions and then we're going to reveal the lucky winners of the book. Tiffany says, how does breeding behavior relate to a change in bacteria? Are there certain behaviors that birds are doing that are increasing the bacteria or odor levels?
Great question. And I did not address this in the talk, but I did a study looking at testosterone levels. So in both males and females, hormone levels, sex hormone levels go way up when they go in breeding condition. And testosterone goes up in females too. And there is a strong correlation between testosterone and odor. So I suspect that these hormones are probably affecting the preen oil, which would then affect the bacteria that feed on that preen oil. We know that there are bacteria in the human armpit, for example, that feed off of testosterone byproducts, which is one of the reasons why men and women smell different.
If you go to TED Ed, there's a video about armpit bacteria and body odor, and it is excellent for middle school students in classrooms.
Awesome.
All right, the last one we'll take is Britta. Is there a metric to measure how well birds detect scent? Who is the best scent detector in the bird world?
That's a really good question and so hard to answer. What we've found is that context really matters. Birds will pay no attention to odors that have no effect on their world. And so early studies trying to compare these abilities across species weren't getting anywhere because they weren't using odors relevant to the animal. Good question, but yeah, I guess you could look at like parts per million in the air and think about how they detect it that way. So I would bet that birds like the seabirds, like the albatross, who's detecting the scent of phytoplankton from hundreds of feet up in the air, I bet they're pretty good.
I will thank you, Dr. Danielle Whittaker. We enjoyed your talk. People love to
you.
learn about animals and their new and senses that we didn't believe they possessed. And we do have quite a few thank yous if you want to check Danielle in the chat box. We have lots of thank yous and excellent jobs. And the 2 book winners for tonight are Robin and Francie. So very good. If you want to send me a private message right now through this chat with your address, I will give it to Danielle's publisher and they will send them out to you. And remember, we're tieseducation.org, or you can go to our Facebook page or Twitter page. We actually have one webinar coming up in December, but then the International Carnivorous Plant Society is also doing a webinar on December 5th, and then ours is the following week. But on the December 5th one, they're going to be talking about pitcher plants, the Nepenthes pitcher plants in Southeast Asia, and all of the symbiotic, mutualistic little microorganisms like flies and caterpillars and crabs and frogs that live in the pitcher plant. So they're going to talk about the coevolution of those things, which will be exciting. And then the following week, we're going to do some stuff about bipedalism from a scientist who is just coming back from South Africa. So we have a lot more exciting stuff to come. And we thank everyone for attending. And thank you, Danielle.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.